Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our event today, Global Warming and Political Cooling, Addressing Climate Change in a Hostile Federal Political Climate. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the president of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. And I think it's auspicious that it's such a beautiful day outside, somewhere in the 70s in the middle of November. So maybe that gives us some additional grist for the mill today. For those of you who are not familiar with the American Constitution Society, we are a national network of lawyers and law students, judges and policymakers who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. We work for positive change by shaping debate on vitally important legal and constitutional issues through the development and promotion of high-impact ideas. Before we get into the discussion today, I would like to thank Covington and Burling for providing us with this really beautiful room today, and particularly to thank Holly Fechner, who has been a dear friend to ACS and to me personally for many years. So today's panel. Despite the best efforts of many, federal climate change legislation has not passed. Most political analysts seem to agree that the current political climate and the looming presidential election make the prospects for passage of such legislation quite dim in the near future. It has been suggested that after the election, and when the economy recovers a bit, chances for such landmark legislation might improve. But unfortunately, the scientific community tells us that the Earth will continue to warm, and the climate change crisis will not wait for these issues to resolve themselves, because the damaging effects of global warming know neither election cycle nor Dow Jones. So what can we do in the interim? What state and local initiatives could prove productive? Given the Supreme Court's recent decision in American Electric Power versus Connecticut, which blocked state and local governments from using the federal courts to file public nuisance claims to limit greenhouse gas emissions from electric power plants. Given that case, what other bodies of law or litigation strategies might be employed? Do these litigation strategies have limitations or drawbacks? And what allies from both the private and public sectors can be brought into the effort to address the climate change crisis? These are very difficult questions, and we are very pleased today to have an outstanding panel of experts to address them. I have the honor today of introducing our moderator, Jerry Waldron. Giving all Mr. Waldron's credentials would take hours, so I'll be brief, because you do have a fuller description of his many, many accomplishments in the handout that you received when you came in. Mr. Waldron is a partner here at Covington, where his practice focuses on communications, technology, energy, and climate policy. He has over 25 years of experience in law and public policy, most recently serving as the staff director and chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. In this role, he was closely involved in all the significant energy and climate-related legislation in the House, including the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009. We are extremely lucky to have him here today. Jerry.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. And I'm happy to be here, and just to sort of elaborate on some of the points that Carolyn had made. I think we are living, sadly, in a historic time, and I think it's sometimes easy to think that your time is unique, and everyone thinks their time is unique. I think if you ever go back and read history in it. But when I was on the Hill, I was fortunate enough to be involved in legislation, significant legislation over many years, and I was actually on the floor when Waxman-Markey passed in June of 2009. So about 2 years ago, just think about where we were. So a short walk down memory lane. You don't even have to go back too far. Just two years ago, where were we? The House had passed climate change, and we were awaiting the Senate to act. 2 years ago this week, and I actually went back and looked at my calendar, 2 years ago this week, Todd Stern was going office to office and meeting with folks to talk about his plans for Copenhagen. the rumors had begun to be floated that the president was going to go to Copenhagen in a month. And that was going to be the culmination of this grand sort of time and strategy. And Lisa Jackson was fully in charge at EPA, and they were pushing forward not just with aggressive improvements in CAFE, but there was talk that they were going to regulate mercury and coal ash, and frankly, all of these aggressive moves were going to kick in and affect coal burning units even before the cap and trade regime that it was in Waxman-Markey would take place. So it was going to be a sort of a 1-2 punch. What a difference 2 years makes. Today, after the November election last year, so less than 12 months ago, President Obama was asked about climate change legislation. He said, cap and trade is not going to happen next year or the year after that. And he could have stopped. But he then actually, if anyone remembers, he then said, or the year after that. So that, sort of signaled where the sort of White House was. The main debate in Congress for the past year, and I would submit likely to be the main environmental debate in Congress for the next year, is how much authority should we take away from EPA? How many rulemakings sort of should we block at EPA? And indeed, one can say that one of the notable activities of the Obama administration for the past year has been a trimming of its sails in this area, lest they be accused of sort of killing the economy. So that is a pretty radical, almost head-spinning change, looking sort of 2 years back, and where are we today? And I dare say the picture won't look any different over the next 12 months. So I think, as Carolyn said, the summary, does indicate that we have the political cooling. I note that there was a report last week that 2010 was the largest year for greenhouse gas emissions in history. So that part of it continues to mark on. So I think we can stipulate that the title is accurate, that in terms of at least greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, and the political environment is certainly cool towards direct regulations and changes of it. And so today we want to explore sort of what that means and where to go from here. And on that subject, we have 3 excellent panelists to cover the issue really from a different perspectives. I think that will lead to a healthy and lively discussion. We have Aurilio, who is what are you, director? Sorry. Director of Environmental Action and a longtime activist at the national, state, and federal level, who she will talk about a study that EA released just recently to talk about the way forward in this regard. We have David Doniger, who's the policy director and senior attorney for the Climate and Clean Air Program at NRDC, and is a longtime activist and leading Clean Air Act thinker in this area, who is going to discuss some of the novel and new legal theories that are out there, as well as the EPA's role in the Clean Air Act. And lastly, we have Andy Clubok, who was fortunate to join us. He's a partner at Kirkland Ellis and has been deeply involved in the key environmental litigations, not just for the automobile industry, but for other affected industries over the years. So that is sort of our perspective. We're going to turn to them and let each panelist sort of give their presentations and their approach on the different parts of the problem. I will say the Clean Air Act is somewhat of an iterative process. Congress creates the Clean Air Act, there is litigation, it goes back to EPA, it goes back to the courts, Congress weighs in periodically. That's sort of been the story of the Clean Air Act for the last 30, 40 years.
That's not one important part. The air gets cleaner.
And the air gets cleaner. So it doesn't lend itself sort of to a neat timeline in that regard. But I think after the 3 panelists are done, you will realize that this is a complete picture. And as a last note, I want to say that once I was on the Hill and it was obvious that energy and climate change legislation were not going to go anywhere, and I was a staff director and I had a staff of 12 people, and I brought the average age of the staff up to 27. So all my 22 and 23-year-old staffers, and they were crushed. They were crushed by it. It was like, Well, I actually worked on two pieces of legislation that you've heard my old boss, Ed Markey, refer to a lot, and Mr. Waxman also referred to a lot. One was the 1990 Clean Air Act, and one was the 1996 Telecommunications Act. What do the two have to do with each other? Absolutely nothing, except they both went through the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is why I worked on them. So other than they have nothing to do with each other. And I said to myself, well, I started working on the 1996 Telecommunications Act in 1984. Actually, I helped draft a bill that ultimately you can trace the provisions in that bill if you did an archaeological dig all the way to the 96 Act without fail. And it got reintroduced, then it got bigger, and then it got... And in 1985, I was a staffer on the subcommittee on energy conservation and power, and we held a hearing on a provision about renewable energy and clean air, which ultimately found its way into the 1990 Clean Air Act. So I gave that just as a little bit of an object lesson, that it was a heady time in 09 and 010. Things were going to happen overnight, and suddenly the world is going to change. These things take time. I'm sort of been at this game long enough that I actually think good policy is tough to do overnight. Sometimes I realize that the environment needs urgent help in order to get these things right so they're sustainable over time. That's hard to process. So that's my optimistic note that I will end on and turn to Anna.
Great. Thanks so much. My name is Anna Aurilio, and I direct the Washington, D.C. Office for Environment America.
What
We
I say?
love environmental action,
just...
but it's okay. We're a federation of 29 state-based, citizen-funded organizations. We're active across the country, and we come out of the public interest research group. So I've been here in D.C. for about 19 years. Before that, I was in Massachusetts studying physics and environmental engineering. And I'll say that us graduate students at MIT were allowed to go to the Kennedy School of Government and see lectures. So in 1990, I went to see a lecture by Senator Al Gore. And he gave it wasn't a PowerPoint those days, it was the overhead projector. Exactly. It was the overhead projector that was basically the outline of an inconvenient truth. And, we were all fascinated by it. A couple of years later, I came down to DC to work on environmental issues. And, back then you could say that scientists were warning that global warming was happening. And if we didn't do something about it, bad things were going to happen. So we should do some things as an insurance policy. And we've sort of come a long way, both in terms of actually seeing some of the impacts and the discourse and the level of public understanding. And yet, unfortunately, politically in Washington, D.C., sometimes it seems like we're no closer to having a comprehensive solution. That said, I am very optimistic as well. And what I'm going to talk about is the report that Environment America released about a month ago. You can find it on our website. I have a bunch of hard copies too, called The Way Forward on Global Warming, basically making the point that while comprehensive federal legislation, and some of us still bear the scars of that fight for several years, may not be robust and alive right now, that there is actually quite a bit that we can do. And we looked at a suite of policies at the local, the state, the regional, and the federal level that we think we can move forward on, and in fact are. And we find that we can get to, 20% reductions from energy use, 20% below 2005 levels by 2020, and 34% by 2030. That doesn't mean that we've abandoned the quest for a global warming solution. In order to get to the levels that science says are necessary, we're going to have to actually enact comprehensive climate legislation. But there is a ton of stuff we can do to reduce tons. And so I'll talk about that. So first and foremost, we know that we need national legislation that caps emissions and puts a price on carbon. We also see, when we go up to Capitol Hill, the enormous political clout that's arrayed against us and the very much emboldened fossil energy industry that's spending millions of dollars to sort of stop and really try to question the very need for doing this. So our focus on moving forward is to work on campaigns that get us short-term victories and emissions reductions and build our political power, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first and foremost, again, as a federation of state-based groups, we have a real precedent for success. So a lot of the policies that were rolled into the American Clean Energy Act, ACES, were actually policies that had seen success at the federal level, including renewable electricity standards, energy efficiency measures. We've seen wind power production up 5 times and solar production up 8 times since 2004, in part due to federal incentives, production tax credits, the Economic Stimulus Act, but also in part due to a lot of state policies. We have energy efficiency savings through utility programs have increased by 3 times. We have, the most fuel-efficient cars and light-duty vehicles rolling off the assembly lines that we've ever seen. And again, when I came here in 1993, CAFE was a long way away. And we finally actually now are taking advantage of the increases in technology that have been happening ever since Ronald Reagan put a freeze on CAFE standards. And we're finally capturing that to make more fuel-efficient vehicles. So that's great. And then actually state carbon caps and auction revenues are actually helping to bring down emissions. So we are bending the curve on emissions in the United States. Obviously, the recession has had some impact, but DOE has looked at this and said actually clean energy policies, mostly adopted by or originated by the states, have actually made a very significant contribution to these reductions. So that's one. We've actually made some progress. 2 is we've already had some changes in the political playing field. Again, at the federal level, we're not seeing that at all. But one of the things I want to highlight is that our experience is that clean energy industries and building the constituencies that benefit from these policies has already had an impact. So if you look at California, the oil companies went in and tried to roll back the global warming cap. 60% of California voters said no. And it was the defensive campaign was supported and funded by the clean energy beneficiaries of that program. In the northeastern states, we are still engaged in what I like to say hand-to-hand combat on defending the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Our best allies and people that are providing us with the political clout to actually defend this very effective policy are the clean energy industries that have gotten the revenues from the auction. And so, that teaches us, number one, if you're going to cap, you've got to have revenues invested into clean energy, and 2, then mobilize the political power that you get as a result. And finally, in Ohio, where Governor and former Congressman John Kasich is the governor, there's a real effort now to roll back the clean energy standard, and we think, at least as of this moment, that he's actually at least neutral on the topic, in part because of clean energy supply chains that exist in Ohio as a result of the clean energy mandate. So that's 1. 2 is labor unions sometimes can be our greatest allies, sometimes not. Utilities in some parts of the country are increasingly aligning on these issues. And then the automakers have been coming to the table and actually, negotiating on these rules and supporting the rules. So that's great. The steps forward are not rocket science, right? We need to, first and foremost, become more energy efficiency. We need to shift to cleaner energy. We need to reduce our oil consumption through better planning and transportation. And then we also need to finally, reduce the actual pollution, put a cap on the pollution. So what did we do? We looked at 30 policy tools and measures. There's a whole list in here. Energy efficiency standards for household appliances, utility efficiency programs, increased fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards for vehicles. So in every forum, whether it's local, state, or federal, we looked at policies that we thought we could move forward. So in transportation, clean fuels, including clean fuel standards, clean cars, including the EPA standards, and then obviously a lot that can be done in transportation and land use planning. Clean energy policies, so strengthening and defending existing renewable standards, and creating incentives both at the state level and at the federal level. Obviously, there's some important tax policies that are coming up. Energy efficiency, this is always kind of a yawning thing, except for people then who actually get it, which is buildings in the United States use 40% of the energy, and actually that's 10% of the world's energy, which is outrageous. So we can go a lot by ramping up building codes. And the building code process is fascinating, but actually quite valuable, and architects and other builders are actually quite on board with the goal of having zero net energy new buildings by 2030, utility programs, and then finally climate policy. So pushing ahead with whatever we can get at the federal administrative level, and then actually defending and pushing forward at the state and regional level. So again, the results when we modeled all these policies were 20% reduction from 2005 levels by 2020, 34% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. And then we actually broke it down regionally and state by state. So what were the best sectors to look at if you were in a particular state, and what's the best opportunity? And then I'll just leave with the strategy that we're thinking of, which is one, we know the public supports us on these issues. The public is with us on global warming and the need to do something about it. The public is with us on clean energy. In fact, I think the most popular topic that I work on with the public is solar power. 92% of the public hearts solar energy, so that's great. We'll build on that. So we want to capitalize on public support, wage campaigns that actually build on that support, and actually get victories that will reduce emissions, and then use those campaigns to ultimately build comprehensive, across-the-board support to move forward on global warming. So, I mean, basic principles. One is wherever we can get emissions reductions, wherever we can get them quickly, wherever the public support exists, we're working to do that, and as are many of our allies in the environmental and clean energy community. While we weren't successful at passing a comprehensive climate bill in the last several years, the environmental community actually worked together as we never have before, and that's actually been quite successful now at our push to both, push forward on Clean Air Act standards for power plants and defend EPA's ability to do those standards. So we're working together better than ever before. I think we could still do a better job at uniting the state and local campaigns into a more focused effort, but we're working on that. We would like to erode the power of big oil and king coal in the field of public policy. I think that's a long-term fight, but that is what this is going to ultimately need. And then get the public engaged at all levels to engage in this fight. And then finally, the other thing I think we really need to do is make sure that we continue to capture people's imaginations, that we have put forth a bold vision. So ultimately, we'd like to live in communities where people's houses use no net energy except for the energy that they produce themselves on site, where they can get to work or school or play through alternatives other than driving. And if they have to drive, their car can plug into the solar panel on the roof. Things like that that capture people's imagination, and then actually where they can see some of these things happening in their neighborhoods are really important. So with that, I'll turn it over to my good friend and ally, David Doniger.
Great. David?
Thanks very much, Anna. To start, I want to quote the antithesis of Moore's Law. You know, Moore's Law is the maxim that computing speed doubles every
18 months.
18 months. Well, there's Doniger's Law, which is that the interval between enactments of the Clean Air Act doubles with each iteration. So 1967 was the first important Clean Air Act, 3 years to 1970, 7 years to 77,
There we
13
go.
years
That's pretty good.
to 1990. And so the effort that we all made to pass this legislation, which would have been Clean Air Act 4.0 in the last Congress, was premature. So it will be on schedule if it happens by 2016.
There we go.
And we hope for better. But meanwhile, NRDC and I personally have been trying to pursue a portfolio approach over these years, much as Anna described. And it has action at the state level, the federal level, the international level. But at the federal level, just focus on that for a moment. We were really pursuing 3 strategies simultaneously, really for the last 20 years. And that is, first, to use the existing law. We have a national climate law. It's not perfect, but we do. It's the Clean Air Act. There are other relevant laws too, the CAFE law. But these are long-standing pieces of legislation. From 1970, in the case of the Clean Air Act, it has had the legal tools in it to deal with all kinds of new pollution that come along, including greenhouse gases. And that, of course, is what the Massachusetts case was all about. The second strategy was to seek the new legislation. I won't talk too much about that right now. But not as an alternative to the Clean Air Act, but as I said, Clean Air Act 4.0. The third strategy was one to use an even older branch of law, the law of interstate federal common law nuisance law. There are cases that stemmed from the early part of the 20th century that recognized the right of one sovereign state to sue the polluters in another state over the cross-border pollution. And so we pursued all these strategies and state and local strategies as well, the international treaty process as well, the full portfolio. I'll just focus on those sort of three federal approaches. The nuisance theory actually sort of depended on the position of the Bush administration, which was that the Clean Air Act didn't apply to carbon or climate change at all. Their position was that whatever Congress said in 1970 and subsequently, it just didn't mean to include carbon dioxide. It's somehow so different. And so while that case, which culminated in Massachusetts, was moving forward, state attorneys general, combined with 3 land trusts that NRDC helped represent, brought a case under this 100-year-old doctrine of interstate air pollution. And our contention was, look, especially if the Bush administration position was correct, there was no federal legislation. And the niche that the Supreme Court had recognized for a continuation of a federal common law in this interstate pollution area, that niche was survived and was viable and valid until and unless there would be legislation that displaced it by providing a regulatory solution to the carbon problem. As you know, we working with 14 other states and 15 other environmental groups, we pursued as well the challenge to the Bush administration's interpretation, and it resulted in the Massachusetts decision in 2007 that carbon is in fact an air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. It's no different from any other air pollutant. If it's dangerous to public health or welfare, then the different parts of the Clean Air Act can be applied there. And since then, EPA has in fact moved forward, and this was what Lisa Heinzerling, our missing panelist today, would be celebrating. First of all, I would like to celebrate Lisa's role in that litigation. She won awards, as well as the ultimate decision, for her brief writing in Massachusetts versus EPA. And then she went on to EPA during the current administration and worked on the endangerment determination vehicle regulations. Huge achievements coming out of the existing Clean Air Act and building on the effort at the state level that we all worked on to, starting with California, using its rights under the Clean Air Act, other states having their rights to opt into the California program. There were vehicle regulations. Perhaps Andy will address this further, but again, one of the first big achievements of the Obama administration was to pull the federal Clean Air program, the state program, and the CAFE program together in one 3-part common program where the car makers can build to a common practical code. They can build cars that meet one set of cars that meet 3 sets of requirements and meet all the car companies' interests in national uniformity and our environmental interests in a very high level, aggressive level of carbon emission reduction and fuel economy increases. I'm getting the threads of my story mixed up, but as you can see, the one that's dominating, the one that's done the best so far is the use of the existing Clean Air Act. The nuisance case was rejected in June of this year in Connecticut versus American Electric Power versus Connecticut, at least in the injunctive relief setting. The theory is being pursued in a damages setting in a case called Kivalina, which I know Andy will speak more to, and I'll make any further comments on Kivalina in Q&A. But at least the injunctive theory is gone. But what did the Supreme Court say? It said in an 8-0 opinion, whereas Massachusetts was mere 5-4, said this is EPA's job under the Clean Air Act. Massachusetts had spoken directly to cars under Section 202. The Supreme Court in Connecticut spoke directly to power plants under 111. And EPA's job includes dealing with the carbon emissions from power plants. Today, in fact, the OMB regulatory review website indicates that the rule under Section 111B to address new source carbon emissions from power plants has gone to OMB for the 90-day review. And so we are hopeful and optimistic and so very supportive of this move, hopeful that there will very soon be a proposal of new source standards, and we're going to continue to push EPA to address existing sources, as EPA has previously committed to do, under Section 111D of the Act. So the very substantial pathway forward is under the Clean Air Act. It is working. Some of our other strategies didn't work. They were in the alternative. The legislation, undoubtedly we need legislation. Again, we need Clean Air Act 4.0. We need to fend off somebody else's versions of 4.0, which is all legislation to take away the Clean Air Act authority. These things go through the House without a thought, and I use that phrase advisedly, kind of regularly. But none of them have passed the Senate. The Senate in April rejected 4 proposals to cut back on the carbon authority. They are likely to reject today a proposal to overrule the EPA's interstate cross-state rules for the very dangerous pollution that causes interstate smog, certain smog. The mercury standards are coming out in December, according to the most recent schedule. As I said, the first carbon standards are now in the OMB interagency review pipeline. So we will keep on keeping on with the Clean Air Act. The motor vehicle, second round motor vehicle standards are also about to come out, pursuant to another landmark agreement with the car industry. And a lot of progress is being made. What I've said for years is you can take a big initial bite out of carbon pollution under the existing Clean Air Act. You can't make the long-term reductions that are needed out to 2050 in the optimal, predictable market creating way through the Clean Air Act. At least that's difficult. But you get started, and we're going to keep working on this and keep fighting to defend the existing law and use it vigorously to deal with this great threat to our future.
Great, thanks, David. Andy, you get to wrap up here?
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Clubok. I'm a lawyer, and as was mentioned, I've represented a number of folks who are on the other side of some of these issues, some legal. I represented the auto industry in challenging efforts to impose electric car vehicle regulations and fuel efficiency regulations for climate change purposes. And I represent oil industry in defending the use of courts to try to use the tort system to address climate change. What I'm going to say today does not necessarily represent the views of my clients. I'll make that disclaimer. I'll also make the disclaimer that I, in 2000, worked very hard for Al Gore to be elected, including going down to Florida and counting Chads, like probably a lot of folks in this room. I worked hard for John Kerry. I worked hard for Obama. I'm going to work hard again for Obama. And I will also make the disclaimer that I don't think the things I'm going to say necessarily reflect their views. In fact, what I'm going to say probably doesn't reflect the views of most of the people in this room. But I am here because I'm a member of ACS. And although I have some different views on how to address global warming, I do agree very much, and I think we all need to keep in mind the principles of ACS. Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, the law should be a force to improve lives, right? That's one of our fundamental principles. And when we think about how to use the law to improve lives, I do think we have to think about things, sometimes the bigger picture. Some of the things you've heard today in the narrow focus, and it's absolutely important that we have people who are narrow focused on their particular issue. It's good that we have labor leaders who are narrow focused on their issue, and it's good that we have environmentalists who are narrow focused on their issues. But for those of us who aren't in those narrow spheres, we have an obligation to take all of that in, consider it all, and make hopefully good decisions about the net effect and what we should do to have law improve people's lives. Okay. With that preface, I'm going to make 3 points today. I'll try to make them quickly, and we can maybe get to questions. Number one, a lot of us are lawyers here. The tort system, if any of you practice tort law, is uniquely ill-equipped to deal with climate change. In fact, it is probably the worst way you could possibly think of in coming up with sensible policies to deal with global warming and climate change. Terrible to have a trial federal court district judge trying to handle these problems, let alone a state court judge or a jury. That's the reality of the situation. It's bad policy. The fact that the effort, all due respect, to dig back 100 years to a doctrine that was created 100 years ago and try to make that the vehicle for how we're going to come up with sensible policy to deal with this global problem, on its face should cause people some concern, but I can talk specifically why that just cannot possibly be a sensible way to approach this serious problem, okay? Second of all, I'm going to, I heard a lot, and I heard a lot of good proposals, or at least proposals that sound good, but at the end of the day, Anna said something, and she said, look, we got to do something. We got to do everything and anything. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But she's nodding, and David, I think, would agree too. Their view is we just got to do something. We got to do everything we can do, no matter what. And what I would say is I will quote James Hansen, who is one of the fathers of this movement and developed some of the early climate models and is widely considered to be one of the experts. What James Hansen said under oath when I cross-examined him was, I try to do useful things, okay, and I'll come back and talk about that in a second. He said, I try to do useful things, and that's what we should be doing is useful things, not anything and everything. As important and serious this problem is, and I'm not trying to minimize the importance of it. So my third point, and this one may particularly rankle some here, the reality is, I believe, and I haven't heard anything yet from this panel that suggests otherwise, but I'm really interested in learning, I believe that we don't know how to solve this problem. I believe we are capable, we're smart, we're a great country, we're a great world to some degree in some cases. And I think we can figure this out. We've figured out how to solve tough problems. And I think we need to, and I think we need to do everything possible to figure out how to solve it. But that's what we should be focusing our attention on, and we should recognize that we don't know how to do it right now. Okay, so briefly, those 3 points. The tort system, I don't know how much I need to say about that. There's nothing like global warming. There's no analogies. All the cases that you have where even when a state sues another state because upstream, North Dakota is polluting some river that goes into South Dakota or something like that, and there's maybe 100 polluters who are contributing along the river, and you have a really complicated, difficult problem. Global warming is nothing like that. Global warming is a whole different level where every single human being, since the dawn of the industrial age at least, or maybe since the dawn of farming cows, has contributed to this problem. And it is impossible to use traditional tort means of assigning liability or divvying up responsibility or assessing damages, given that, for instance, the auto industry I don't know if there's union people in this room, but most people would say the auto industry built the middle class in this country and did a lot to improve people's lives. I mean, significantly improve people's lives. And now are we going to say, all right, well, you also caused global warming, so everybody who ever worked in the auto industry or is a descendant of the auto industry or my relatives from Detroit, you guys should all, I don't know what exactly, you're responsible for the problem. Problem with that is all of us drove cars everywhere in the country, and we drove cars to improve our economic lives and to improve the lives of our children, and so we're all responsible too, right? This is the problem. There is no way that a damages action in court, and we could go through it. We could talk about legal doctrines like the political question doctrine or standing or redressability, and we can try to apply 100-year-old doctrines of federal common law or 90-year-old doctrines of exceptions to federal common law or 60-year-old doctrines of exceptions to the exceptions. But at the end of the day, it does not make sense to deal with this problem in a courtroom, okay? That's my number one point. Second of all, do useful things. I will give an anecdote, and I brought with me, we are not using audiovisual, but I will give you guys a link. We submitted comments in the EPA waiver process from testimony that we elicited under oath from many people who've said things like James Hansen publicly, other climate scientists, regulators, most every regulator at the state level at least, who tried to address climate change through fuel economy standards. We had an opportunity in a court case that ultimately settled, what David was alluding to, with a very good settlement for everyone. But we had a chance along the way.
He's the only guy who's ever deposed me.
That's it. How about that? Not bad, huh? And he was a very good witness. He's tough. Someone prepared him well. But I think I'm probably the only one to depose James Hansen and other people. And they said some very interesting things once they were put under oath. James Hansen said, he testified on direct examination that, of course, climate change, he predicted it. He has one of the best models in the world, or he developed it. He has access to it. He is seeing these terrible things happening, and he could predict, temperature increases with carbon dioxide emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a horrible problem, okay? He testified to that. He also said, similar to Anna, we've got to do something. Well, the issue that was before the court in that case was whether or not these fuel economy standards that California was trying to impose, California and about 11 other states were trying to impose in those states, instead of going through the federal CAFE process, the states were trying to do it on their own, which we argued was preempted and et cetera. James Hansen said, global warming is a terrible problem. It's just an awful problem. It's going to destroy the world. We have to do something. And you should do this fuel economy program. That was essentially his testimony. On cross-examination, I said to him, okay, you say the global warming is terrible, and you say we must do this, which, by the way, is going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars and put thousands. We said tens of thousands. The other side said, oh, no, it's only going to be thousands. But some large number of people out of work, okay, with more predictive certainty than the climate change models, all right, that people are going to lose their jobs. And I know people may not want to hear this, but we and the government recognized this. The government said, yeah, we acknowledge there'll be fewer sales, and our models show people will lose their work, although we say it's only a few thousand families, not the tens of thousands of families that you're worried about. So we had this debate. So we said, look, it's going to cost hundreds of millions. It's going to put a lot of people out of work. Their lives are not going to be made better. But, if it's a global problem, it's going to fix the problem. We understand. So with your model, what is the benefit going to be from this regulation, which we know is going to have these immediate impacts and it's going to be expensive, et cetera? Oh, well, I don't know. Well, what do you mean you don't know? Have you used your model to predict what the impact would be? And James Hansen, and again, I could show you his testimony. He said, no. I said to him, question. So you never modeled. Forget about Vermont and New York. Let's say that it's all 11 states that have adopted the regulation. Have you modeled that? Have you found the computer time or the time to model the total CO2 emissions savings in all the states that adopt the regulation? Previously, I had said to him, have you ever turned that computer on and used it for an hour to figure this out for California? He said, no, I never did that. So I said, well, how about if you assume all the states adopt it? Have you ever figured out what's going to happen if you spread it out over the next 100 years? He said, no, because we try to do useful things, okay? That's why he never turns his computer on. He said, I wouldn't run a model with such a very small change because you're wasting computer time, because you have the problem of finding a signal when compared to the natural variability of the climate. The reality is the reason he didn't run his model, we ran his model for him. It didn't take very long. if the entire world adopted these fuel economy regulations, which was going to improve fuel economy by 20 miles per gallon roughly, and you projected the benefits for 100 years, you assume people keep driving cars for 100 years, the impact on global warming is too small to measure. It's not even measurable. It's like predicted at a computer level of like 1/1000th of a degree Celsius. Okay, but it's so small that James Hansen said he wouldn't waste his afternoon on his computer to even model this. Yet on direct examination, without being pressed on this, he said, "What we have to do it. We clearly have to do it, even though it's not worth the few dollars it would take for me to model the value of it. We must do it." And that's a real question. That's the kind of question that we need to be seriously thinking about. And I'm not just saying this because I happen to represent the auto industry there. I'm saying it, and David can disagree, but the fact of the matter is I willingly took on this representation because I really thought there was big concerns about doing things like this that are so expensive and so potentially damaging to people's lives, potentially, that you better have a good reason for it. Now, we talk about decreases. Thomas Coquette, who is the Deputy Executive Officer of the Air Resources Board in California, I asked him, look, you've pushed for this, you insisted on this regulation. I said, what real-world impact would a 27% reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions by the year 2030 have on the temperature of California? He said, it'd have a small, very small impact. You're talking about ambient temperature? Answer, yeah, ambient temperature. You mean too small to measure, correct? Answer, probably. And in fact, as we went through, and I've got pages and pages of this, they had to acknowledge that with a 30% reduction, the problem with this problem is it's so great that a 30% reduction or massive reductions that we probably can't even achieve don't end up doing useful things, unfortunately. But they're very expensive. And so we have to question if they were a step, if it was the first step towards a journey of fixing a problem, you would analyze it one way. If it is, as was ultimately admitted by some of these people under oath, a symbolic effort, and you're going to spend what might be not unlimited dollars in this country, you have to consider what you're doing. So that leads me to my third point. I don't think, and I didn't hear, you don't usually hear that connective step that James Hansen wouldn't make in court. In other words, you hear people say it's a terrible problem. I agree it is. Okay, I'm not a global warming denier. Okay, I think when people are putting that much stuff, whatever it is, in this case, carbon dioxide is less harmful than certain other things we put in the air, but it's too much stuff probably to be put in the air, and it's likely to have some significant impact. So what should we do about it? That, or can we fix the problem? I think that one is not known now. But we do know that some of the solutions we have absolutely will never have a measurable impact. If we improve fuel economy standards, but we keep driving cars for 100 years, which is where you try to predict the miles to, we're doomed, right? We have to replace the combustion engine before 100 years or we're doomed. So doing stuff like that isn't a stopgap measure. It doesn't give us another 5 or 10 years. It has no effect whatsoever. Now, there's all kinds of good reasons to raise fuel economy standards. The whole reason we passed the CAFE law in the first place was because the oil shocks the 70s, and we want to say, to the maximum feasible extent possible, automobile manufacturers should improve their fuel economy standards. But the reality that people may need to look at is that climate change is probably not one of them. And I know that's a difficult thing to hear when you just want an answer. When you say, look, we fixed the ozone problem. We've cleaned up rivers. There has been dramatic successes with the Clean Air Act. Dramatic successes, as David said, the air is cleaner, much cleaner, okay? Because we had problems that were solvable, maybe expensive, but we knew how to do it. We found an answer, and we applied them. And those are the kinds of things we should be doing. That's a useful thing. At the end of the day, the last thing I'll just say is David said something about, I think he said there was a number of different things we've done. Maybe it was Anna. We've become more energy efficient. We've reduced oil consumption. These are good things. And finally, we're reducing pollution. Well, look, I know today that there are rivers all over this country that we could clean up because we know how to do it. We could have an immediate positive impact on people's lives. We have water wars coming. We have a fish apocalypse coming. We have all kinds of terrible environmental problems that we are dealing with today. And to be honest, I think we should research the heck out of global warming and figure out what, if anything, could be done in a cost-effective way. But in the meantime, are we diverting attention from things that we know are hurting our kids today, tomorrow, in the near term? I mean, You know, the Bush administration, we heard with pride how the Obama administration is more focused on global warming, climate change. They've also collected less penalties in enforcing the environmental crimes that we have today than the Bush administration did in the last couple of years. I mean, can you imagine this? You know, we elected someone who we believe is an environmentalist, and certainly I don't think anyone in this room, most people in this room, unless you've slipped in, probably don't think of George Bush Jr. as much of an environmentalist. But his EPA, you know, in at least the last couple of years, collected massive penalties by enforcing environmental crimes, and they focused on getting the polluters and going after them and cleaning up stuff. And to the extent that because the focus has been diverted, because there's not the same, you know, maybe there's some transition time for whatever reason, I'd rather see folks focusing on that and increasing that and doubling and tripling those efforts than just saying, hey, it doesn't matter. We know there's a big problem, so we just got to do something, anything. At the end of the day, if I said to you, I'm starving, okay, I've got to do something. I'm starving, so I'll eat my necktie. Okay, I got to do something, you know. And I'm not. I look at your face, I'm sure you think I'm trivializing this problem. But the truth is, if you're starving and you say I'll spend $1 billion for a grain of bread, that's not going to fix your hunger. And it's in the meantime not a smart way to approach the problem when you do need a strong economy to deal with the environment. You do need to focus on problems that we know how to address. And at the end of the day, whether it's statutory law, regulatory law, or judicial law, we in this room are supposedly committed to using the law to improve people's lives. And I think that's a standard you need to look through every time you look at a specific proposal on dealing with climate change. There you have it.
Thank you, Andy.
I feel like I'm the skunk at the picnic,
No,
but that's okay.
You're a good guy to be there. It's given us a lot to sort of think about. Why don't we sort of first turn to David and then Anna, just for a little bit of rebuttal, and then I have some questions as well for all the panelists, and then if anyone in the audience has questions, please think of those, and we will get to you as well.
Well,
David?
I really just have one quick comment. Apart from the fact that those arguments didn't prevail in either of the two courts which reached decisions. But more importantly, they haven't prevailed in real life because, as you mentioned, these cases were settled, and they were settled, as I mentioned, through the Obama administration's first and now second clean car peace treaties, as I call them. And the bottom line of this is the car makers have the uniformity they sought, the environmental, the many people, the states, the environmentalists, the federal government, many people who are advocating for it, have the emission reductions that at the level California was seeking for the first package, and in fact, nationwide, the second package is pretty good too. And the predictions are that these vehicles will cost less to own and operate. If you buy your car on a loan or a lease, which most people do, your net payments for the new car and for gasoline go down in the first month that you roll the car off the lot. So it's a winner from the first month. The car makers are reviving around a strategy of making smaller, more efficient vehicles. The Auto Workers Union is fully behind these agreements. They've been built into the recent contracts. There are a lot of there are studies that NRDC and the auto workers have done together to demonstrate the benefits, the economic rebuilding benefits to the supplier network. This is a winning strategy for car makers as well as everybody else. Everybody won. And it sort of suggests that the testimony you elicited somehow, your interpretation of it anyway, doesn't correspond with how reality is unfolded. And of course, the standards that you were sort of hypothesizing that those standards would be met in 11 states and stay flat for the next 100 years. In fact, you know, we have a national solution, and it's progressed to a second level of emission reduction progress. And everyone would expect, although it's too early to do it, that after 2025 we've made more progress. So this has just been a totally winning strategy for everyone involved, including your clients.
Right, and just in brief, we said, our clients said at the time, with this strategy that was being pushed, if it was being done, would not work on the timetable that was being forced upon, and would certainly lead to massive financial problems in the auto industry, if not bankruptcy. We were laughed at. This was 2005 and 6. The odds of the auto industry could go bankrupt seemed preposterous, right? The auto industry in this country will survive forever. We were tricking littles, okay? Now, what happened, and it's sad.
It's going to be tough to blame the bankruptcies on that.
The truth is, with the auto bailout, the reason when this case was settled, okay, it was because it was in the midst of a overall restructuring and bailing out of the auto industry, which was critical and important. I think folks in this room probably agree, although people, our friends on the other side of the aisle, were willing to let the auto industry go. But as terms of that settlement, what happened was, first of all, they took care of some of the other problems the auto industry had that prevented them from doing the things, investing the money they needed to invest to improve fuel economy. Second of all, the timetables were stretched out and changed, and the standards were lowered, so they didn't have to meet the standards that everyone realized was impossible. But third, at the end of the day, it's absolutely right. I agree with David completely. We now have, as the law requires, the maximum feasible fuel economy requirements by the car auto industry. And all that's a win-win-win, okay? Except the effect on global warming, let's not kid ourselves, is too small to measure, too small for James Hansen to get out his computer and spend 5 minutes on, because neither it, nor expanding to the country, nor expanding to the world, nor doubling it for 100 years will ever have an impact on global warming. And that's the sad truth. Okay, so it's a wonderful thing. It's great to improve fuel economy. It's great for other reasons, but we just have to be honest with ourselves. It's going to do zero, nothing, not even added to 10 other things like it to affect global warming.
There we disagree.
Anna?
Phew, I did not realize I had spent the last 20 years of my life not doing something useful. Boy, I better call my parents and go, it's all over. You wasted your time. Okay, where to start? So absolutely, I think we're doing something that improves people's lives. And then the last point that I made in terms of principles for going forward, which is capturing people's imagination, clearly haven't captured yours. So obviously, we think the Obama administration and those standards should have been much, much stronger. In fact, when I came to DC in 1993, we tried to improve CAFE standards right then, and we knew at that point, and the National Academy of Sciences agreed with us at that point, that we had the technology to dramatically increase fuel economy. In fact, as you know, automobile engines over the last 20 years have become much, much more efficient. Most of that efficiency has gone into pickup instead of into miles per gallon. And, you know, I love driving my little Jetta around. It's really fun, but it's painful every time you have to fill up. So first and foremost, I think the auto industry should have done a lot more quickly. And I'm glad they finally are. But our vision in no way talks about getting to wherever we're going to get in these 2017 to 2025 standards and stopping there for the next 100 years. You're absolutely right. That will not make a difference in global warming. We need to do more. We need to get off oil. In fact, we have another report about how to get off oil. You can't get from here to there without going through some of these incremental steps. And then back to my old physics days, what we're talking about is the area under the curve. So if we don't start bending the curve downwards, all those emissions, the quicker we can start bending it downwards, the smaller the area under the curve is. So you're right. We probably don't have the computer speed or, what do you call it? Granularity, thank you, to be able to measure small changes. But all of these things added together, I believe, actually will make a big change. And moreover, they get us on track to start doing things dramatically differently. So we need to get off oil. We should start by increasing the fuel economy of our cars. Then we should layer on the infrastructure to get to electric vehicles powered by renewable energy, and at the same time be building communities, and especially in places that are being newly developed, where people don't need a car to get around and they can walk and bike. And that has all kinds of other side benefits, but I want to hit global warming head on because I do think it's the biggest problem facing humanity, and I don't want to be the person that leaves my daughter in charge of solving it. That's one. Second, on renewable energy and on cars too, I'm actually totally saddened that the U.S. auto manufacturers had to buy the hybrid technology from from Toyota, that Ford has to lease it from Toyota, that back in the Clinton administration, there was this big, investment, taxpayer investment in new auto technology, and the U.S. car manufacturers didn't even want to talk about CAFE. There was a process to try to get them to the table, and they didn't even really want to take any U.S. taxpayer assistance to try to develop more efficient cars. And what we're ending with now is foreign auto companies eating our lunch and U.S. automakers having to lease back the technology. I'd like to actually change that. I'm Environment America. I'd actually like this country to regain the leadership we used to have in some of these technologies and hang on to the leadership that we already have. So I actually feel like it's very good for our country, not just in terms of bending the curve on global warming emissions, but actually maintaining our leadership and making sure that people graduating from college today actually can go out and try to solve some of these problems and innovate as well. And then last but not least, as someone who went to high school in Woburn, Massachusetts, which was a poster child for dirty water. Exactly. And kids in my high school actually had leukemia from that contamination. I look forward to working with you on clean water, but I have to say, I don't think ConocoPhillips has come out publicly, although maybe they have and I've missed it, but EPA is moving forward on restoring clean water protections to all waters of the United States. And the quote from Exxon at the time they came out with that guidance was they're going to wage a war, a litigation war on clean water. So happy to work with you on whatever issue you want to work on.
Okay, well, look, we agree on the third point, although I think that should be the focus, and I think we can actually measure results, which is important. In terms of saddened that we had to buy technology from foreign car companies, I couldn't agree more. It's unfortunate. The difference in Japan and Europe, to a lesser extent, versus the U.S., and the reason why they have better fuel economy, and they had it in the 90s, and they had it in the 2000s, they have it today better than the U.S. There's a lot of reasons. None of them are because their government forced them to have better fuel economy standards, okay? When we're talking about what the law does, not a single one of those countries have better fuel economy, not a single one, because their governments forced them. Why do they have better fuel economy? They had expensive gas, and in that sense, it's the government forcing, and I fully agree. Well, I fully agree with that. You know, gas tax in this country average something like 40 cents a gallon, and gas taxes in Japan and Europe average something like $5 a gallon. So when gas was $8 a liter or whatever the conversion is there, those countries, people demanded better fuel economy, and the auto industry in those countries planned for that for 10, 20, 30 years while we were having a party on $1 a gallon gas. Okay, and the idea that you can just come and say, regardless of the $1 a gallon gas, and regardless of the fact that people like their boats and they like to haul stuff and pick up trucks, and we also have a different makeup than Japan and Europe, so we have big open spaces and we have people with all that stuff that they like to have. We have automatic cars instead of manual cars. We have air conditioning where they don't have air conditioning in all these cars. So all of those things are what caused much worse fuel efficiency and much higher CO2 emissions from the American fleet. Not a single one of them was caused because of government regulation in those countries making it better. And so when we now look at how to fix the problem, when we came all of a sudden, we said, oh my gosh, fuel economy is worse in this country than it is in Japan. And oh my goodness, why are they developing hybrid technology? Why did Toyota go do that? It's because gas in those countries were $7. Families are small, streets are narrow, they don't have much space. Some of those things we probably aren't going to do anything about, like closing down our wide states. But other things like gas taxes, we should have done something about. And to just all of a sudden come and say, fix it, immediately have better fuel economy technology would be like someone coming along and saying to a doctor, cure cancer. You have a year, get it done. And if you don't, you can't practice your medicine anymore. That's where we disagree on both. I think we both agree on the problem. It's how you use the law to fix the problem that I think we have a disagreement on.
We've spent a lot of time on the fuel economy issue. I think it'd be helpful maybe to turn to the other sort of half of the equation. And just a short question and then a longer question. The short question, for the benefit of everyone in the room, probably a few people know this, but in terms of the AEP versus Connecticut and the nuisance theory and your point about is tort law appropriate for this, I think it'd be helpful, and either of you can tackle this, what was the Obama administration's argument in that setting, and sort of why did they sort of take out the position that they did? I'm hoping that's a neutral question. Not
Yeah, that is.
I mean, either of you can tackle it. But yeah.
Short thought. I mean, the Obama administration, well, among the 5 defendants was the TVA. The TVA is a mixed institution, but it's a federal government institution. the Solicitor General represents the TVA in Supreme Court litigation. The federal government didn't represent TVA in the lower court litigation. Now, I'm not defending this because actually it made me very angry
Yep.
to see the
Right,
position.
right, I'm
taken.
just saying, it's just a neutral.
But
Yep.
I believe what happened is the Solicitor General was requested by TVA to represent it in the Supreme Court. And the position they took, which was that EPA was on the case and that a settlement had been entered in other litigation that we had brought to set standards under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. And therefore, the litigation should be displaced. That was the theory they settled on, the principal theory they settled on. And I wish they had taken the position that you should really just park the tort case, wait to see if the EPA actually does issue those standards. And then if they do issue those standards, it's that action rather than the mere authority to take that action, which would be displacing. That is not the position the federal government took, and is not the position the Supreme Court took, at least with respect to the injunctive, the part where the Clean Air Act and the role of the courts in framing future injunctive remedies would intersect.
Right.
And it leaves open, that's the case that you're in, and some of my former colleagues in the other case are in, but I'm not in the damages case.
Yeah.
But it leaves open, as far as I can see, the question whether the Clean Air Act displaces the damage, the backward-looking element, as much so as it displaces the forward-looking injunctive element.
Right. And would you say it's fair to say that the Supreme Court largely adopted the government's view of the case, that essentially the injunctive side, we have a Clean Air Act, we have the EPA, Massachusetts versus EPA gave that job to the EPA, so EPA should do that job, and we're not going to let tort suits sort of gum up what their regulatory regime that they may or we expect them to sort of put in place. And then, Andy, why don't you talk about the damages sort of part of it, where that fits into the story?
Right. Well, so in a nutshell, the government said, and the court has agreed, EPA is an expert agency. Okay. We already said, the Supreme Court said in Mass versus EPA, the EPA gets to look at carbon dioxide just like they get to look at any other emission. And so we've got to follow the normal standards, which is the expert agency looks at it. What the expert agency does is reviewable by, in this usually the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So there's judicial review on the agency, and that's the way the system will work to best come up with whatever regulation should be come up with. What it'd be incredibly dangerous to do would be to allow different courts all over the country, one court, let alone multiple courts, making different determinations about what should be done. And what David is worried about, for example, is the EPA might decide not to regulate or not to do nearly as much as he would have them do. And what the Supreme Court says, hey, even it's the EPA's field. So if they decide not to regulate, and that's confirmed by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, assuming there'd be challenges to that decision, it's still displaced. It's not like it's if the EPA acts, everything's displaced, but if the EPA doesn't act, then other states can step in. We've entrusted this complicated issue to an expert agency, and we have judicial review of it, so that's where we're going to settle this problem, at least in the regulatory versus court world. Now, we really should be settling it if we had a functional Congress in the Congress, but maybe that's far away. In terms of what's left in damages, there are two cases that are still out there, okay? One case says that Hurricane Katrina was caused by global warming. Okay, and that oil companies should pay the extra damages. Now, maybe people in this room believe that, they just believe it. The causation problems alone would clog the court systems for the next 50 years to litigate. That is not a litigable case ultimately, and we've won so far, but we're still litigating that there. Also, of course, we know there's been lots of seasons with fewer hurricanes than normal. Was that because of climate change? It's just not a litigable issue. Similarly, in the case in California, there's a very, very small Alaskan village out on this horrible peninsula way out in Alaska that's been suffering from beach erosion for like the last 50 years. And their village literally is getting smaller and smaller because of the erosion, and they're eventually, the Army Corps of Engineers says they've got to move. There's a native Inuit, native Alaskans, they don't want to move, but they also say, damage was caused. And so they're saying it's because of global warming. Now, the notion, again, that we're going to come up with any kind of sensible judicial doctrine to assess liability for that, to apportion damages, to take into effect that the plaintiffs themselves are responsible because, if they've ever driven a car or lived in a house or, done anything, the judge is responsible, so we can implead the judge. I mean, those kinds of things make that case an impossible case to try. So we have a number of different theories there, including things like the political question. We say this is the kind of thing that should be dealt with in Congress. We have standing issues. We also have displacement. We say it doesn't matter if it's damages or injunction. When the EPA acts, states can't then enforce things, be it through a damages suit or an injunctive relief suit, and that would be the problem there.
Great, thank you. Why don't we open up to questions? Anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
If you could wait for the mic, please.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Sure.
In the front row here.
Someone with a pad must be a reporter.
You'll hold it. Okay. Dave Grossman, Greenlight Group Consulting. Too many questions to take up the time we've got. Just two quick things, I think. First, on the nuisance stuff, which I've written about and been somewhat involved in. So I think there's a question there. I'm going to go with the nuisance stuff. Anyway, I'm not going to touch with the nuisance stuff for now. I'm just going to focus on one other question. There's been a lot of discussion for now about carbon, and I was wondering if any of the folks have thought about short-term possibilities for the non-carbon GHGs, short-term climate forcers, black carbon, etc. Those seem to be less contentious in the current political environment, at least potentially, and could at least buy us some time. I was wondering if there are strategies being pursued on that. I'm just so tempted to get into the nuisance stuff for now, but I'm going to leave it aside for now.
David?
Well, sure. First, the United States has done a lot of things already to address black carbon, diesel particulate rules, fuel rules, and so on. And there are still more things that can be done. There are programs we can support, especially in other parts of the world, to deal with the amounts of soot that come from basic home cooking with crummy open fires and their cook stoves that can actually dramatically reduce the amount of wood or other fuel people have to go out and buy or collect. So this can make their lives better. At the same time, it reduces the indoor pollution and the black carbon load. We should be doing a heck of a lot more of that. We're working within the Clean Air Act on methane. Methane has a shorter lifetime. There is a regulation proposed for the oil and gas exploration and production, which would deal with the emissions of VOCs, volatile organic chemicals, and methane, although not directly. Methane is, we're still going back and forth with EPA about directly regulating methane, but they're regulating the VOCs and catching a lot of methane along the way from, and this will apply to the kinds of wells that are being drilled in the Marcellus Shale and the shale gas expansion all over the place. So I know there are lots of water problems and issues related to the fracking, but the air pollution problem is serious, and EPA actually has a proposed rule that's out there that we're going to support and urge them to make stronger. We're also pursuing hydrofluorocarbon, HFC controls under the Clean Air Act and under the Montreal Protocol. So there are quite a few things that can be done on all fronts, from the very shortest lived gases to the ones that are going to be around, like my favorite is sulfurofluoride, which will be here for 25,000 years. So, if you keep sulfurofluoride out of the air in your lifetime, you're doing a big service for future generations. We're going to keep using the tools we have to pursue those things and seek new tools ultimately through new legislation.
Other question? Sir, over here.
Hi, I'm Brian McPherson. I'm a retired DOE attorney. I'm troubled that nobody's touched on what is, I think, the biggest problem with global warming, and is that it's a international, worldwide problem. And if we were to suddenly be able to cease burning coal in all power plants in the United States, it would accomplish nothing if instead that coal were wound up being exported to other countries that would burn it. I'd like some comments on the global aspects of the issue.
Anyone want to sort of jump on that? I mean, let me sort of start by saying, as somebody who sort of worked on the legislation and was working with the Obama administration leading up to Copenhagen, I think part of the thinking was that the U.S., there's no question that a large percentage of the CO2 is red, white, and blue, as my old boss used to like to say. And so we have a responsibility because we were one of the leaders in the industrial age when many other countries were aspiring to the industrial age. In addition, there is the leadership role that the U.S. has played in other environmental areas, and we sort of expecting everybody to jump first is the problem. And so, at least from that perspective, I think the notion was, yes, we do want to make sure that China and India and the EU and the other G20 countries are part of the conversation. But does the United States have a leadership role, not just because it is the wealthiest country, but because it also has a historical debt that is frankly bigger than many of the other countries? So that's one perspective, but I offered
just
others.
make the initial observation by analogy that, you'd say that no state could make a difference by setting auto emission standards. And yet, out of the action the states took, there's a complex legal and political reaction, and it ended up with a national program that goes not less far, but farther than the original state program. And that has spillover effects. It's an international car market, so the innovation that it's triggering worldwide is going to affect carbon emissions in cars built in China as much as it's affecting carbon emissions from vehicles built here. I believe you get to an international agreement through a combination of unilateral action and hard bargaining with other countries. You have to show that you mean it in order to insist that other countries act. So a certain amount of leadership is required. One could argue that, there has to be some reciprocity. You take step one, or you may take step one and step two, and then you demand step one from other countries before you take step three. I think it's iterative and interactive, and the Chinese are intensely interested in what we are doing domestically. It is the measure, I think, frankly, for advocates of aggressive policies in their own country. It is one of the arguments they use with people in their own governmental leadership that they're arguing with. Say, look, we don't want to be left behind. We want to lead the solar industry. We want to lead the wind industry. We want to be on top of energy efficiency, because the old model where we wait till they go first and then we copy or steal their technology is not the one we want to work on for the indefinite future.
Maybe I missed the thread there. I mean, maybe not surprisingly, I disagree with some of the folks in this panel. I'm not sure I'm agreeing with you, but I think so. This is a global, they call it global warming. It's a global problem that you have to consider that in every policy decision we advocate. So for sure, one of the things on this panel originally was what can local and state governments do to assess the problem? Realistically, nothing that's going to have any measurable impact. But we do need to address this globally. And with all due respect, the debt that we owe, this country has paid its debt for being a rich country, I think, in many ways that have been positive to the world. Things that China and Russia have not done historically, not to mention some other countries and the way they treat people. And so when I look at, I mean, we have to go forward from where we are today. We know that China, if it hasn't overtaken us, David probably knows, it's about to overtake us. It's, it has? Okay, it's had. So China's already overtaken us, and there's no end in sight. So the notion that we are going to primly lead them to be better while they're charging towards economic prosperity is a little naive, I would say. Now, to the extent we can push, pull, prod, force them to change their ways for a variety of reasons, I think we should try to do that. But the idea that we're going to unilaterally, in other words, if we make a hard decision, it's easy. When David tells you, oh, we force people to do something that's going to be cheaper and better and more efficient, that's wonderful. If that's true, and where that is true, and where the government can do research to create the internet or create GPS or create things that make us more efficient, and wonderful. Who's against that? No one. But the reality is, when there are programs that are being pressed that are going to cost significant amount of money, and we have a limited amount, right? And we can spend it on a jobs program, we can spend it on cleaning up a lake, or we can spend it on what we think is going to address global warming. We need to make smart decisions about that, particularly given the global nature of this. And at the end of the day, only wealthy countries care about the environment. Okay, we've only started cleaning up the environment when we got rich, and other countries, it's when they get rich, they eventually have the luxury to clean up the environment. If you look at the latest polls today, Europe used to care a lot about global warming. They today don't care about it at all, right? It's like 12th on the list of things. If you look at recent polls of the people who are living, do you think the people right now who are living in Greece or in countries where the unemployment is very high and they're totally uncertain about their economic future and their kids, you think global warming is at the top of their list or down about 10th or 11th now? Unfortunately, that's the case. When you don't have the luxury of stability for your family and economic security and certain other things that are, health care and things that are needed to live, when you don't have that luxury, you don't have the concern or the time or the resources to think about global warming and those kinds of problems. And that's the thing we have to address.
I'm going to go to Anna and then the next question.
Actually, there are poor countries that care a lot about global warming, the ones that are soon to be underwater.
I guarantee you every one of them would take an air conditioner today instead of our long-term work on global warming. I guarantee.
We're not going to settle that debate. We're not going to settle that debate here. I promise you we're not going to settle that debate here. Next question. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Andy kind of brought us back to why I think we were here initially, which was to talk about the state and local programs. And I hear that there may be consumer programs that are on target and things that we could try to do. But what is the authority? And I think David said, as the courts have said, you have to go through EPA and the Clean Air Act. What's the authority for the states and local governments to do policy-oriented programs that might have an impact?
Can I just add on to that question? And in talking about it, think about what, and this, because this is a question I had, sort of think about it not just from tackling it from the clean air side but the energy side perspective. Yeah. So in terms of renewable energy standards, green banks, promoting solar, wind, and the like, in terms of activities sort of at the state. So let's not get back into the preemption cul-de-sac.
Could I just say one sentence to at least dispose of it in terms of my answer to that, is that the Clean Air Act authorizes, in the field of stationary sources, states to do anything. It doesn't preempt them from doing anything. In the field of motor vehicles, it allows California the space to set vehicle standards and allows other states to choose between the federal and the state. But that's all contained within the Clean Air Act. Energy side, you want to talk about?
Yeah, on the energy side, 28 states in the District of Columbia have renewable electricity standards. Those were passed either in the legislature or in a couple of states, first by ballot initiatives. And again, reinforcing the story that if you pass it, they will meet it. So in several states, the utilities at first vigorously opposed. In fact, Colorado, where our group was very much involved in moving it through the legislature. For 3 years in a row, we got crushed at the bitter end. We got the Farm Bureau of Colorado on board. We passed a ballot initiative with popular support. In fact, I think that year the ballot initiative got more votes than whatever the winning senator was. And when we went then back to the legislature to strengthen that standard, in fact, I think double it, the local utility then came on board and supported us in that effort. So, and that was, Colorado, which now is a shining example of clean energy. So that's one forum you can use. obviously, local governments have a lot to say about land use planning and zoning, and you know, it's a very hard place to actually fight in, because the change is very incremental. But if you put systems in place where people actually don't need cars or can use cars far less frequently, that will get you long-term reductions and lasting reductions, which is what we're talking about. And then obviously there's regional compacts. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where governors opted into it, is another place where you can make change.
Yeah, and again, not to be a skeptic here, these are all wonderful programs, and I support them to the extent they create clean, renewable energy, cheaper energy in the long term, get us off dependence on foreign sources of energy. Those are all great goals. We have great benefits from those things. I assume that's why people ultimately were for them. The reality of their impact on global warming, I would like to see a study that shows how that will ever, even multiplied by a 50,000, ever affect 1 degree of global warming. And I suspect it won't. The other thing, I'm sorry to focus on this, but I really ask people in this room is, do you think there's a single person who lives in an African country or wherever they're predicted 70 years from now to be underwater? You think there's a single person there that would rather us spend $10 million on a global warming program, or to get the mosquito netting and a clean well and maybe a car, if they, in a dream world or something? I mean, there's not a single person, I dare say, in those countries that would make that choice over this. And I doubt anyone in this room would, if those are really the choices you were facing with. Environmentalism is a luxury. Why are those choices? Because well,
Defense spending and mosquito nets.
fair enough. You're right, and you're right, and they've done studies. I agree with you. Okay, I'd spend less on defense. I'd spend more on education. I'd probably spend most of the priorities the same way you would. Okay, is my guess for most of the people in this room. But I think if you went in a room and you said, "Here's the total dollars, and here's the cost benefit we get from what we know how to do today," I just highly doubt it, because I still haven't seen it. I see people say the problem's terrible, and I see people say, here's some things we could do that will reduce carbon dioxide. I haven't seen anybody say, for this cost, we're going to see this benefit, even if you multiplied worldwide 100 times, whatever the metric is. That's why I say we don't know how to solve this problem yet. We should figure it out. In the meantime, we should do useful things.
I'm going to sort of wrap up there with Andy has made his useful point. And I'll give a minute to David and a minute to Anna as sort of a wrap-up point that you would like to sort of leave with the audience.
Well, there are a lot of people suffering around the world already because of the changes in the weather, whether it's floods in Pakistan or droughts in Africa. And they care about a lot of things to get them up out of poverty, keep them from slipping back into poverty. This is one of them. And that's why those countries, those governments, are pressing for action from the industrial world. Now, it's not as simple as it used to be, with a clear divide between the industrial countries and the developing countries. China, India, Brazil, they are industrializing developing countries, and they have, and so the old rules don't apply. But we have to make progress here at home to make the credibility to join with those forces in other countries which also want to address this. This is, humans are creating this problem. Humans can solve this problem, and we need to work at all the levels, local to international, to get it done. And that's what moves me in the morning.
Anna?
I did this work because I want to solve problems, and I'm proud to be a director of a DC office of a federation of state groups. I absolutely believe that state and local governments and individuals joining together can make a huge difference, and that's what gets me going in the morning.
And on that note, on behalf of ACS and Covington Burling, thank you all for coming, and let's thank our panelists.